I transmigrated into a book, becoming the Northern King, commander of a 1,000,000-strong army. However, in the very next moment, I received an imperial decree. The decree essentially said, "General, surrender. You wouldn't want your beloved to suffer, would you?" At a glance, I knew this was a typical female-oriented romance novel. According to the original plot, I, as the commanding Northern King, was supposed to obediently relinquish my military power, return to the capital, and face the Emperor's judgment. This would pave the way for a melodramatic love-hate relationship to unfold. But things were different now. I had transmigrated. The soul of the Northern King had been replaced. Before transmigrating, I was meant to return to the capital for judgment. After transmigrating, I was still expected to return to the capital for judgment. What was the point of transmigrating if nothing changed? I let out a cold laugh and shredded the decree into pieces. "The Sacred One is truly clueless," I sneered. "He knows Victoria is my beloved, and yet dares to take her into his harem. Surely there must be treacherous ministers deceiving him. Relay my command, assemble the troops and march south. We will cleanse the Sacred One's court and rid it of these vile traitors." In female-oriented novels, the protagonist's starting point is often the end point for a male-oriented protagonist. If this were a male-oriented novel, reaching the position of commanding a 1,000,000-strong army would have meant it was time to consolidate power and prepare for the next step. But in a female-oriented novel, the Northern King's army was merely a backdrop for the tragic love story involving Maxwell, Victoria, and me. Now, however, things were different. From 0 to 1, I might not match the original Northern King, but from 1 to 10, the Northern King was no match for me. "Your Highness, the army is assembled." Lieutenant River entered the command tent and saluted. I nodded. "Let's go inspect the troops." River frowned slightly but said nothing. In the original novel, River was the only one who urged the Northern King to rebel. He once said, "A real man need not fear being without a wife. Why risk your life for a woman, Your Highness? Why not lead the army south, storm the capital, and seize the throne?" But the Northern King responded, "Victoria's in the palace. If I'm late, I fear the Dark Lord may harm her. Do not speak of this again." River persisted in his opinion, driving the original Northern King to such fury that he had him flogged 50 times and stripped of his rank. Filled with resentment, River colluded with the barbarian tribes and became the novel's ultimate antagonist. As we neared the troop formation, River hesitated before speaking. "Your Highness, caution is still advised." I chuckled softly. "With the Northern Army at my command, what can Maxwell possibly do to me?" River's eyes lit up. "Your Highness, I have a plan that could help you achieve great things." "Speak," I said. River explained. "Years ago, when the barbarian tribes invaded, the land was devastated and the nation teetered on the brink of collapse. It was thanks to Your Highness raising an army in the north, rallying refugees, and fighting for a decade that the nation was restored. The people of this land owe their lives to Your Highness. Why not reveal to the world that the Sacred One has forcibly taken Miss Victoria? Let it be known that the fault lies with the Sacred One, and then raise your army to cleanse the court. No one will oppose you, especially since Miss Victoria holds the gratitude of the Northern Army's officers and soldiers. If this news spreads, it will unite the troops' hearts in your favor." After finishing, River stood silently, looking at me with hope in his eyes. I brightened at his suggestion and clapped him on the shoulder. "Excellent. This matter shall be entrusted to you." River was overjoyed and saluted. "Your command is my duty." I, along with River, inspected the Northern Army. I must admit, this army was indeed formidable. Ironclad armor, sharp weapons, disciplined ranks, and high morale. Most importantly, their eyes reflected unwavering loyalty. With such a mighty force at my command, how could the world not bow to me? Suppressing my excitement, I feigned a look of melancholy. River, meanwhile, inadvertently mentioned Maxwell's abduction of Victoria and the decree summoning me to the capital. The soldiers soon began murmuring among themselves. The officers in the ranks pretended not to notice, allowing the soldiers to discuss freely. I was on the brink of starvation when Miss Victoria gave me a piece of bread. That's the only reason I survived. If it weren't for the pot of rice porridge Miss Victoria cooked, my entire family would have starved to death. Our entire village lived off the fish bait Miss Victoria prepared for us. Without her, we wouldn't be here today. Your Highness, lead us to the capital and rescue Miss Victoria. The murmurs grew into a unified roar. Your Highness, lead us to the capital and rescue Miss Victoria. I smiled with satisfaction. The troops' morale was mine to wield. Taking a deep breath, I shouted, "March south! Rescue Miss Victoria!" The officers and soldiers echoed, "March south! Rescue Miss Victoria!" The annals of the first emperor later recorded, Maxwell's incompetence and his seizure of the first emperor's consort enraged the emperor's soldiers, who gnashed their teeth in fury. True to his loyal nature, the first emperor sought to calm them, saying, "This calamity surely stems from deceitful ministers misleading the Sacred One." Hearing this, the soldiers were pacified. Leaving a portion of the troops to defend against the barbarian tribes, I led 200,000 soldiers, claiming to command 1,000,000 in a grand march south. Lacking any real knowledge of military strategy, I entrusted command to River and several other generals. A decade ago, during the barbarian invasion, the entire northern defense system had been obliterated. The current system was rebuilt by the original Northern King. In other words, every border commander from the eastern frontier to the capital owed their position to him. Female-oriented novels often insist on making the male and female leads paragons of virtue, which can lead to some awkward plot points. But in this case, it worked to my advantage. My reputation, or rather, Victoria's reputation, was impeccable. The various regional commanders had all benefited from Victoria's kindness. When they heard that I was heading south to rescue her, they didn't hesitate to pledge their support. As for the common folk, it was even more straightforward. To say they welcomed me with food and drink would be an understatement. It was as if they were willing to sacrifice everything to see us succeed. I said to an old man, "Sir, you only have one son. We can't accept this. You should go back home." The old man choked up and replied, "Our entire family owes our survival to Miss Victoria. Now is the time for us to repay her." After much persuasion, we finally accepted his basket of eggs and sent the family back. This was just one of countless similar encounters. Since I set out, people from every corner seemed to appear as if out of nowhere, eager to provide all sorts of assistance to the army. Along with their help came some strange and inexplicable occurrences. A one-eyed stone figure, fox cries piercing the night, ancient scrolls unearthed from a fish's belly. To win their hearts, I personally greeted many of the people, though the sheer number of them was overwhelming. Even meeting just a few left me utterly exhausted. By nightfall, the sight of countless torches carried by the people created a magnificent sea of stars. From above, my 200,000-strong army seemed like nothing more than a thin thread amidst this luminous expanse. I found myself in a moment of reflection. Was I the Northern King because Victoria loved me? Or was Victoria so beloved by the people because I was the Northern King? I couldn't tell. I truly couldn't tell. In just a few days, I led the vanguard to the outskirts of the capital. My lieutenant had dispatched light cavalry to destroy relay stations along the way, cutting off all communication. As a result, the people of the capital only now realized that I had arrived, with my army in tow. Inside the royal palace, Maxwell's face darkened as he handed a letter to the chief eunuch, instructing, "Deliver this to the Northern King immediately." In the original novel, Victoria had anticipated being used as a bargaining chip to threaten me. The moment she was captured and brought to the palace, she tried to take her own life multiple times. Though, of course, she never succeeded, because otherwise the story wouldn't progress. Concerned that Victoria might succeed in her attempts, Maxwell had her bound with iron chains. Worried that a single royal decree wouldn't compel me to return, Maxwell decided to force Victoria to write me a letter. Naturally, Victoria refused. So Maxwell captured Victoria's close friend and personal maid, threatening her, If you don't write the letter, I will kill them both." Victoria, being the selfless and compassionate woman she was, couldn't bear to see others suffer. After Maxwell cut off one of her maid's fingers, Victoria reluctantly agreed to write the letter. The letter, however, contained only a single word: return. It was clear she had written it under duress. Maxwell didn't dare push her further and sent the letter to me. In the novel, when the Northern King received the letter, he immediately realized Victoria was being tortured. His heart shattered. But now, "Your Majesty, Your Majesty!" A young eunuch came running in, panic written all over his face. Maxwell frowned. The chief eunuch beside him barked, "What's the matter? Why are you in such a state? Compose yourself." The young eunuch, gasping for breath, stammered, The Northern King is here." Maxwell threw his head back and laughed. "Ha, I knew it. The Northern King loves Victoria to death. Using her to threaten him was bound to work." The chief eunuch flattered him. "Your Majesty is truly wise." Maxwell grasped the chief eunuch's hand and said, "You've also contributed to this success. Once we capture the Northern King, I'll reward you handsomely." The chief eunuch demurred. "Serving your Majesty is my duty. There's no need to speak of rewards." One insisted on giving a reward, the other refused to accept it. The two went back and forth, lavishing each other with compliments for quite some time. Finally, Maxwell turned to the young eunuch and casually ordered, "You there, take a couple of guards and drag the Northern King to the dungeon." The young eunuch pointed to himself, his face a mask of disbelief. "Me?" Maxwell's face immediately fell. The chief eunuch roared, "You insolent wretch! Are you defying an imperial decree?" The young eunuch dropped to his knees, trembling as he stammered, "Your Majesty, the Northern King, he didn't come alone." The chief eunuch's eyes darted with sudden realization. He snapped, "How many did the Northern King bring?" The young eunuch's voice quivered. "The banners block out the sky. The soldiers are innumerable, at the very least 10,000. Maxwell collapsed onto the floor, his gaze empty, his face ashen. He muttered to himself, "I clearly wrote in the decree that he was to enter the capital alone. How dare he defy my orders?" Outside the capital, I gazed at its grand and imposing walls, letting out a long breath. This was it. This was the turning point. A rebellion led by a feudal lord. Reaching this stage was practically a declaration of victory. My vanguard consisted of only 3,000 cavalry, ill-suited for a siege. Inside the capital there were 50,000 imperial guards. Though many of them were spoiled noble offspring with questionable combat skills, I couldn't afford to underestimate them. A single misstep could turn this into a farce. Now all I had to do was wait for the main army to arrive. Then, the real pressure would begin. In the original novel, if I had entered the capital alone, as ordered, I would have been thrown straight into the dungeon. Maxwell would have wasted no time fabricating charges against me. Maxwell would have someone torture me to force a confession. But I, with my unyielding spirit and resolute righteousness, naturally refused to admit to any crime. As a result, because I wouldn't confess, Maxwell genuinely couldn't convict me. This left him in a state of frustration until he came up with a devious plan. Maxwell sent a keepsake belonging to Victoria, her scented sachet and handkerchief, along with a lock of her hair, into the prison. In my utter despair, I had no choice but to sign the confession. At this point, Victoria heard about my plight. She bribed a few palace guards and servants to sneak out of the palace, infiltrated the dungeon, and met with me. The reunion was deeply emotional, and we poured our hearts out to each other. I couldn't help but think, if you had the ability to pull this off, why didn't you do it earlier? Regardless, after our tearful reunion, Victoria asked me about the charges against me. I told her the truth. Then, she courageously snuck back into the palace. Honestly, it was baffling how she managed to come and go from the heavily guarded royal palace as if it were her private garden. Meanwhile, Maxwell was discussing my fate with the Minister of Justice and the Chief of the High Court. Victoria, standing outside the door, eavesdropped on their conversation. At the right moment, she burst into the room and revealed the truth. I was innocent, and all charges against me were fabricated. In a shocking twist, both the Minister of Justice and the Chief of the High Court refused to convict me due to a lack of evidence. Here, the author takes a moment to marvel at Victoria's wisdom and courage. Maxwell, however, was furious. His face turned pale with anger, yet there was nothing he could do. Reluctantly, Maxwell had Victoria chained and subjected her to various forms of torment. During this period, an unexpected development occurred. Maxwell began to harbor feelings for Victoria. In a desperate bid to win her over, Maxwell used my life as leverage. "My lady," he said, "surely you don't want the Northern King to continue suffering in prison, do you?" Left with no other options, Victoria tearfully conceded to his demands. Despite this, Victoria never forgot about me. She persistently pleaded with Maxwell to spare my life. However, every time she brought it up, Maxwell would retaliate by intensifying her suffering. After relentless negotiating, Victoria managed to secure Maxwell's agreement to let her visit me in the dungeon once a month on the 15th. Each of these visits was filled with warmth and tender moments, showcasing the profound love we shared. Maxwell, on the other hand, was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. While his love for Victoria burned intensely, he masked it with cold indifference, subjecting her to psychological games, mockery, and insults. Yet Victoria remained steadfast in her love for me, declaring, "You may possess my body, but you will never have my heart." This dynamic between the obsessive Maxwell and the resolute Victoria was riveting, a testament to the author's skill in keeping the story alive. As for me, I was on the brink of death in the dungeon, having endured relentless torture. That was when a small group of my loyal soldiers from the Northern Army, undeterred by the odds, stormed the prison to rescue me. By then, I was in a deep coma and couldn't leave any useful information for Victoria. It was already August 15th. Unaware of my escape, Victoria prepared an array of mooncakes in anticipation of our meeting, a description of which was mouth-watering. When Maxwell received news of my escape, he flew into a rage and dispatched troops to hunt me down. On that day, Maxwell coldly denied Victoria her scheduled visit to me, leading to another round of their intense confrontations. Maxwell's torment, Victoria's resilience, and their chaotic relationship stretched across over 100 chapters. Eventually, Victoria decided to investigate for herself. She once again sneaked out of the palace and returned to the dungeon, only to find it empty. Upon her return to the palace, she directly confronted Maxwell, demanding answers. Maxwell, without hesitation, lied and told her I was dead. Overwhelmed by grief, Victoria collapsed and lost her memory. She could only recall that she deeply loved someone but couldn't remember who it was. Seizing the opportunity, Maxwell deceived her, claiming they were childhood sweethearts and that he was the one she loved. Victoria believed him, and the two began a scandalously blissful life in the palace. Over the next 3 years, they had 2 children together. As for me, I had also lost my memory. After my men rescued me and clashed with the royal forces, nearly all of them perished. I was placed on a small boat and drifted downriver to a quaint fishing village, where I was rescued by a kind fisherman's daughter. You can see where this is going, a charming nobleman and a spirited country girl. 3 years passed. Meanwhile, the lieutenant, in collusion with barbarian forces, launched another invasion. The kingdom suffered repeated defeats, and even the small fishing village where I lived was caught in the chaos. Through a series of twists and turns, I regained my memory. Driven by a classic sense of duty to the people, I donned my armor once more and successfully repelled the invaders. Around the same time, Victoria also regained her memory. After over 100 chapters of introspection, she realized she had fallen in love with Maxwell. This revelation led to a climactic confrontation between Maxwell and me over Victoria's love. Just as we were about to clash swords, Victoria, ever mindful of the greater good, leaped from the city walls to prevent the conflict from engulfing the kingdom in war. Her tragic sacrifice epitomized the beauty of a bittersweet ending. Before she died, Victoria wrote me a letter that I received shortly after. In it, she confessed, "We were once so good together, but now I've found happiness with someone else. I hope you can understand and not hold any grudges against me. Please channel your love for me into a greater purpose." The transformation from selfish ambition to a profound love for the people, guarding the northern lands to ensure the nation's peace, I was so moved that tears streamed down my face. Damn it, I really went back to being a loyal minister. But now I've directly led my troops to the capital, and I can't help but wonder how Maxwell will respond. On the second day after setting up camp outside the capital, the Prime Minister came to see me. At first, we exchanged a round of mutual flattery, the usual political niceties. Then, he proposed a game of chess. I was puzzled, but considering his reputation, I agreed. The Prime Minister took the white pieces and I took the black. Sipping a cup of tea, he smiled and said, "The whole world knows that your Grace is a man of loyalty and righteousness. If you lose, would you agree to grant this old man one request?" I had an inkling of what he might ask, given the circumstances. This world of courtly intrigue was far more entertaining than the straightforward male-centric world I came from. I smirked and replied, "And if I win?" The Prime Minister stroked his beard confidently and said, "This old man is known as the chess sage of the Empire. In over 20 years of matches, I've never tasted defeat." I shook my head and said, "If I win, perhaps you should grant me a request as well." He agreed, and the match began. Now, I don't actually know how to play chess. I simply place pieces wherever I felt like. At first, the Prime Minister suspected I was setting up some brilliant trap, but he quickly realized I was just making random moves. The match ended swiftly. The Prime Minister placed his final piece, clasped his hands together, and said, "Your Grace, I must thank you for letting me win." I snorted and said, "Prime Minister, do you truly think you've won?" He glanced at the board, lowered his head confidently, and replied, "This old man sees no way for your Grace to turn the tide." I pointed at the board and sighed. "Prime Minister, sometimes the victory in a game isn't just about the pieces, it's about the board itself. We can't be fixated on this tiny corner of the game. We must look at the bigger picture." The Prime Minister frowned, lost in thought. "What kind of strategy is this? I've never encountered such a concept." Suppressing a grin, I feigned seriousness and said, "This strategy is called Jing, a technique invented by Emperor Jing of the Han Dynasty." The Prime Minister, still puzzled, asked, "Jing? What kind of strategy is that? I've never heard of it." Unable to hold back any longer, I stood up, grabbed the chessboard, and laughed. Swinging the board is called Jing. Smashing it over someone's head is called Jing. With that, I smashed the board onto the Prime Minister's head. The Prime Minister dead. Wiping the blood splattered on my face with a handkerchief, I asked, "How did the Prime Minister die?" A man dressed in a simple blue robe hurriedly replied, "My father lost by half a move to your Grace. Fearing punishment from the Sacred One, he died of grief." Curious, I asked, "You're the Prime Minister's son?" The man gritted his teeth and said, "I am a concubine's son. My father always treated me like a servant." I had heard whispers about this, how the Prime Minister's youngest son was known for his virtues but was disregarded due to his lower birth. I never expected their father-son relationship to have devolved into such a public joke. Satisfied, I smiled and asked, "Do you know what Maxwell and his allies are planning to do against me?" The man straightened himself, speaking clearly and logically as he conveyed what he had overheard from his father and others, along with his own deductions. When he finished, I was stunned. "They spent an entire night coming up with that plan?" The man gave a wry smile and said, "Your Grace is known for keeping your word, and my father was overly confident in his chess skills." Speechless. What kind of minds do these people have? The next day, Maxwell sent the Empire's top rider to challenge me to a horse race, with the same conditions as the chess match. I agreed. First, I ordered my men to shoot both the rider and his horse full of arrows, turning them into porcupines. Then, I casually strolled to the finish line. The poor rider remained motionless at the starting point. On the third day, Maxwell sent the Empire's top archer to compete with me in an archery contest. I had his bowstring cut beforehand. When the time came to compete, the archer exclaimed in frustration, "How can your grace be so shameless?" I replied, "I am the one setting the rules now. You are merely here to follow them. What's the matter? Are you dissatisfied?" 2.5 days later, my army had grown to 50,000 strong. Through the Prime Minister's son, I found several turncoats within the Imperial Guards. Without hesitation, I led my troops in an assault. The traitors did their job well, opening the gates early. We encountered no organized resistance as we fought our way to the royal palace. Before the towering and majestic palace walls stood a stunning woman dressed in white, tears streaming down her face. "Sincere, please go back," she cried. "Your invasion of the palace will cost countless innocent lives. I can't bear to see it. If you insist on storming the palace, I'll throw myself off this wall." The woman was none other than Victoria. Honestly, if anyone else had been this melodramatic in front of me, they'd have been hacked to death long ago. But Victoria's beauty gave her reason. The best way to counter moral blackmail is to lower your own moral standards. When you become despicable enough, they'll expect the more virtuous party to compromise. Swallowing hard, I shouted, "Victoria, if you dare jump, I'll order my men to slaughter for 3 days straight." My lieutenant's face turned pale with urgency, while the soldiers around me cast greedy glances at the ornate mansions nearby. Victoria froze. She turned to look at Maxwell, who stood beside her, his face as cold as stone, saying nothing. I shouted, "The Sacred One must have been deceived by treacherous ministers to make such foolish decisions. Why not open the palace gates and let me in to rid your majesty of these treacherous ministers?" Maxwell gritted, his teeth, his face ashen. Victoria pleaded, "Your majesty, Sincere has lost his temper because of me. Why not open the gates and let him in? Otherwise, I fear he might act rashly and harm the innocent. Sincere is inherently loyal. I can vouch for him. He would never commit treason. If your majesty could just apologize to him, he will still be the brave and loyal northern king he has always been." Maxwell remained silent. Just then, the palace gates suddenly creaked open. The corpulent chief eunuch stood behind the doors and waved at me, whispering, "Northern king, this way. I know a small path." Without hesitation, I led my men into the palace. We captured Maxwell, rescuing Victoria in the process. As Maxwell was seized, he continued shouting, "I am the Emperor. You traitorous rebels will meet a miserable end." I shot a glance at the lieutenant, who immediately understood. He strode forward, punched Maxwell 3 times, and cursed, "Emperor, Emperor, Emperor, you pathetic excuse for a ruler." Maxwell, sporting a black eye, finally quieted down. Victoria, sobbing, threw herself into my arms. "Sincere, I beg you, please don't kill anyone, all right?" Looking at Victoria's tear-streaked but stunningly beautiful face, I didn't even hesitate before saying, "You're right, my love. If they aren't guilty of a capital crime, I'll spare their lives." I had entered the capital under the banner of purging the Emperor's court of traitors. No matter what, I had to root out a group of treasonous officials. Of course, this also provided an opportunity to clean house and install my own loyalists. Positions of power are limited, and those who fought alongside me to take the capital all wanted a share of the glory. But for someone to gain, another must lose. Those in the current court had to make room. Deciding who would step aside depended on their loyalty. To test that loyalty, I devised a simple game. Under the pretense of a river god sacrifice, I led the entire court of ministers and generals to the banks of the River Rhine. Lieutenant River brought forth a deer from the royal stables. Pointing at it, I asked, "Gentlemen, can you tell me what this is?" The ministers murmured amongst themselves. "It appears to be a deer, doesn't it?" "Sir, my eyesight isn't great. What do you think? What is this rebel planning? The wind by the river is so strong today." I cleared my throat and spoke again. "Gentlemen, what do you see before you?" The ministers hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's a deer." Lieutenant Rivers' face darkened and he roared, "Nonsense, this is clearly a horse." The crowd fell silent. After a long pause, the top graduate scholar stepped forward and proclaimed, "My lord, I hail from the southern regions and am unfamiliar with the northern fauna. I must have mistaken a horse for a deer." I chuckled. Crafty but wise. Admitting one's mistakes is a virtue. "Stand over here." Scholar moved to one side. Following his lead, more ministers gradually admitted that the creature was indeed a horse. However, a small group of officials stubbornly insisted it was a deer, their gazes unwavering. I didn't bother with them. Mounting the battle deer, I rode off into the distance. Lieutenant River let out a sinister laugh and ordered, "Seize these traitorous officials and throw them into the river." The soldiers, chuckling darkly, tied up the dissenting ministers, thoughtfully attaching a large stone to each of them. Then they herded the officials toward the riverbank. The condemned shouted, "Traitors, you will pay for this. Better to die righteously than live in disgrace. Your Majesty, I have failed you. The river is so cold. I'm too old and frail to endure this. Spare me, my lord." Among the cries there seemed to be some odd mutterings mixed in, but I paid them no mind. Thus commenced the first and last River Rhine underwater swimming competition. When news of the event reached the capital, I was oblivious to what had transpired. Upon hearing the details, I was outraged. I immediately ordered Lieutenant River to be bound and flogged. "You fool! How could you act so recklessly? Your achievements could have earned you a title of nobility, but now you'll have to settle for being a duke." River, deeply regretful, could only bow his head in silence. After purging the court, I replaced the ministers with my loyal followers. The northern faction's method of seizing power might have been crude, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Within days, the court was firmly under my control. Scholar and the son of the former prime minister began to orchestrate the abdication process for me. Having guarded the northern territories for years and contributed significantly to the restoration of the nation, I was rapidly promoted. The first thing I did was to change the flashy and somewhat ridiculous title of Northern King to the more dignified and majestic Swallow King. I then consolidated the regions of East River, North River, South River, East Mountain, and East Shore into the Kingdom of Swallow, which became my domain. Within half a month, my rank was elevated to Swallow King, Minister of State, Commander of all internal and external military forces, Grand General, Grand Marshal, Chief Minister, and bestowed with the 9 distinctions. I was also granted the privilege of carrying a sword into the royal court, ascending without haste, and receiving obeisance without being addressed by name. Then the petitions for me to formally take the throne began. The first time I said, "This country is doing just fine under the Sacred One. How could you even think of such a thing?" The second time, I said, "Yes, the world is facing some challenges, but there are so many wise men out there. You should find someone else to be emperor." The third time I said, "I am a loyal servant of this nation. I would never do such a thing." By the fourth time, I could no longer refuse. I donned the imperial robe and ascended the throne. As I ran my hand along the armrest of the dragon throne, I chuckled bitterly. "You all have truly pushed me into a corner, haven't you?" Ha ha! After taking the throne, it was time for the Empress's crowning ceremony. The choice of Victoria as Empress was practically indisputable. On one hand, her beauty was undeniable. On the other, her years of charitable deeds had earned her immense respect. Victoria had once advised me to remain a loyal minister and not usurp the throne. I asked her, "What is more important, the well-being of the people or me not usurping the throne?" Victoria hesitated for a long time before replying. "The well-being of the people is more important." I nodded and said, "My love, these past years of constant warfare have left me mentally strained. I've developed a severe mental illness." Victoria, concerned, held me tenderly and comforted me softly. "Sincere, you've been through so much. You've worked so hard." I continued, "When I get angry, my illness flares up and I want to kill people. If I can't be emperor, I'll be very disappointed, and that disappointment will make me angry. When I get angry, my illness takes over and I can't control myself. I'll end up wanting to kill people." Victoria was terrified and clung to me tightly, pleading, "Please don't be angry. I'll agree to you being emperor, won't I?" I silenced her with a kiss and said, "That's not enough. You also need to help me extinguish my anger." The empress's crowning ceremony officially began. It was a grand spectacle, with crowds as far as the eye could see, drums beating, and a lively atmosphere. Everything was proceeding smoothly until Victoria's father, Victor, arrived with his younger daughter. Victor declared, "Your Majesty, this is my legitimate daughter, of incomparable status, far superior to Victoria, who is but a concubine born." Victor and I locked eyes for a moment. His gaze was steadfast, his large eyes shining brightly. I asked, "So?" Victor resolutely replied, "If your Majesty wishes to crown an empress, why not choose my legitimate daughter instead of Victoria?" Victoria looked at Victor with pleading eyes, but he acted as if he didn't notice. I chuckled lightly and said, "What if I insist on making Victoria the empress?" Victor bowed and said, "Then your Majesty would be a laughingstock to the world." I threw my head back and laughed until tears streamed down my face. Pointing at Victor, I said, "You're truly a character. You've made me laugh so hard." Victor's face turned beet red with frustration. I turned to the court officials and asked, "I intend to make Victoria the empress. Does anyone find this amusing?" Not a single person dared to laugh. The Duke of Glory, who also served as my lieutenant, stepped forward and said, "The empress is virtuous and kind, perfectly suited to serve as the mother of the nation." Scholar added, "The empress has a heart for the people. Her elevation to empress would be a blessing for all." The son of the former prime minister chimed in, "Whom to crown as empress is a matter of your Majesty's household. Since your Majesty has decided, we subjects shall comply." The officials all expressed their support. I said, "See, none of the officials are laughing. How then would the people of the world find it funny? Do you have anything else to say?" My tone grew icy as I uttered the last sentence. If not for the fact that Victor was indeed Victoria's biological father, he would have been hacked to pieces the moment he spoke out. If he dared to spout nonsense again, he wouldn't last a few days before succumbing to an illness. Victor lowered his head and clenched his fists as if gathering his thoughts. Before he could say anything, Victoria's younger sister, Rose, jumped out. Rose put her hands on her hips and said in a coquettish tone, "Your Majesty, Victoria can barely cook or clean. How could she possibly become empress?" I asked. "And what about you? What can you do?" Rose counted on her fingers and said, "I am skilled in music, chess, calligraphy, painting, poetry, and song. Furthermore, I am the legitimate daughter of the Victor family, with a noble bloodline. If it were me, I would make an excellent empress." After speaking, Rose proudly raised her head, resembling a swan stretching its neck in defiance of its fate. In this day and age, who cares about bloodlines, except perhaps when choosing a pet dog? Victoria bit her lip, lowered her head, and began to cry, her tears falling pitifully. It was heart-wrenching to see. My heart nearly broke. I sneered and ordered, "The Victor family seems to have been struck with a sudden bout of madness. Duke of Glory, take them away and see they receive proper treatment." The Duke of Glory bowed and immediately had Victor restrained. Rose, crying like a fragile flower in the rain, obediently followed the Duke of Glory. I asked curiously, "Victoria, what are you doing?" Victoria wept and said, "Your Majesty, weren't you planning to make Rose the queen?" I walked over, held her hand firmly, and said, "The queen can only be you. As queen, you'll be the most noble woman in the world." Victoria threw herself into my arms like a homing dove and burst into tears. After the coronation ceremony, I began investigating Victor's affairs. It didn't sit right with me. Such a foolish disruption during the ceremony had to have some deeper, unspeakable reason behind it. Surely it couldn't be that Victor had been brainwashed by some fanatic cult to the point of lunacy, right? As the investigation deepened, I stumbled upon some truths. Victoria, as it turned out, was the child of Victor and the family cook. Her mother was of low status, and Victor looked down on her immensely. The entire household of the Victor family treated Victoria harshly, subjecting her to ridicule and scorn. Growing up under these circumstances, Victoria developed a people-pleasing personality, always putting others first and constantly striving to prove her worth. Later, her mother passed away. Life in Victor's household had been so miserable for both mother and daughter that Victoria decided to take her mother's ashes back to her hometown in New Mexico for burial. One fateful night, the usually timid and rule-abiding Victoria gathered up all the savings they had managed to scrape together over the years and fled the house. Around the same time, an invasion by northern raiders threw the world into chaos. The Victor family, having lost one of their daughters, didn't even bother to look for her. Victoria, being kind-hearted, couldn't help but offer aid to the refugees she encountered along her journey. Before she knew it, a large group of refugees had gathered around her, including me. Victoria's luck held strong. On her way to New Mexico, she stumbled across an abandoned granary. The officials and soldiers guarding the granary had stolen a portion of the supplies for themselves before fleeing south in haste. Even so, a significant amount of food remained. Victoria opened the granary and distributed the supplies, saving countless lives. I took the able-bodied men from the group and began training them into a militia. This was the origin of the Northern Army. However, the question of why Victor had orchestrated such a foolish spectacle remained unanswered, until the Duke of Glory unearthed a handwritten letter from Victor in the possession of the Duke of Sunhill, Maxwell. The letter contained this line, "Your Majesty, endure a few days of humiliation, and this loyal servant will ensure the kingdom's peril turns to safety, and the dark days turn to light." Through interrogations of Maxwell and the Victor household, I gradually pieced together the truth. Victor was a man of extreme loyalty to the previous regime. Even though his daughter had become queen of our nation, he remained steadfastly aligned with the old dynasty. His plan was to rally the remnants of the previous regime and stage a rebellion. Victor assumed that no one would suspect him of rebellion, given his position as the royal father. Many of the old regime's loyalists thought he was merely baiting them into a trap and didn't respond to his overtures. Unable to gather enough like-minded individuals, Victor decided to act alone. Of course, he couldn't launch a rebellion openly and had to resort to underhanded methods. At the time, I had no heir, meaning there was no agreed-upon successor for the factions loyal to me. If I were to die suddenly, my subordinates would inevitably fight amongst themselves for the spoils of power. This chaos would provide Maxwell, the former emperor, with an opportunity to reclaim the throne. Victor had fortuitously acquired a rare and deadly poison from the West, colorless, tasteless, and lethal upon ingestion. Given his poor relationship with Victoria, Victor planned to coat the poison on Rose and send her into the palace. The idea was that during our intimacy, if I couldn't resist certain temptations, I would meet an untimely end. I broke out in a cold sweat when I uncovered this diabolical scheme. What a sinister and heartless plot. As for why Victor suddenly proposed making Rose the queen, that's another story. When Victor suggested sending Rose into the palace, she was overjoyed. After all, I was the devoted male lead in this tale. My looks and status combined were nearly irresistible to most women. However, Rose had a peculiar flaw, an innate mental rigidity, likely a result of generations of intermarriage within aristocratic families to preserve their lineage. Rose believed that as the legitimate daughter, she was inherently superior to Victoria, the illegitimate one. To her, entering the palace with a rank lower than Victoria's was unacceptable. If she couldn't be queen, she would rather not enter the palace at all. Victor tried every means to persuade Rose, but to no avail. This led to the ridiculous scene at the coronation ceremony. Having exhausted all other options, Victor decided to make his case publicly. Rose, with her rigid mindset, followed suit. Victor's outburst ruined my mood. I ordered Maxwell to be beaten to death on the spot, then announced he had died of a sudden illness. As for Victor, given that he was Victoria's biological father, I couldn't make the punishment too severe. I declared that he had succumbed to illness as well, As for Rose, I decided not to hold a grudge against someone so lacking in sense. After establishing our nation, I purged the old regime's aristocracy, redistributed land, and launched military campaigns beyond our borders, crushing the northern raiders. For the next century, the northern regions would no longer face large-scale border troubles. Under the reign of the new dynasty's virtuous governance, peace prevailed across the lands, rivers ran clear, and seas were calm. The world praised the era as one of flourishing order. Gone were the melodramatic tales of turbulent love affairs. Everyone lived happily ever after.